Our next Our next session will be a panel discussion which will explore the digital divide and the impact on education. This will be moderated by Professor Perry Hobson, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Engagement, Sunway University, Malaysia. Professor Perry will lead the discussion today and introduce us to our great panel of speakers. Professor Perry, I will hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Ren, and a very good morning to those of you in Saudi Arabia. And a good afternoon to those of you in this part of the world where I'm based in Malaysia. And I'm sure we've got some people joining us in the evening, so I'll say good evening as well. It's a great pleasure to have you joining us here for this morning's session, which is on the digital divide and the impact on education. Joining me this morning, we have a panel of speakers, and I'm going to very briefly introduce those speakers. Unfortunately, as often happens when you come to an education technology conference and talk about the digital divide, one of the challenges is that some of our speakers have been unable to join us at the moment. I'm hoping they will be able to join us later in the session. So I'm going to introduce them now, and then hopefully they will be able to join us later on. So on screen at the moment, we have Glenn Redovich, who is the head of school and CEO of GEMS Education in the UAE. We have Navin Valrani, the Chief Executive Officer of Arcadia Education, also in the UAE. And I'd like to welcome Ian Price, who is based at Bedford College in the UK. I'm hopeful that we will have Ruby Mahmood, who will be joining us from the Student of Determination Office Director, or as is called ADEC in the UAE, and also Confidence Degoli, who is the Director of Policy and Government Relations for the Independent Schools Association of Southern Africa in South Africa. So I'm hoping that our two ladies will be able to join us shortly. But in the meantime, I would like to move ahead and start with a few questions as we're facing this challenge of the digital divide. And clearly, COVID has thrown into very sharp relief some of the issues of this digital divide over the last few months, as so much of our education has had to move very quickly online, as we have had to restrict the movement of pupils, students, learners, and of course, tourists around the world from traveling. But this has brought for education enormous range of challenges. Glenn, good morning. I'd like to turn to you first. Based in the UAE, you're originally from New Zealand and have been with GEMS Education for a number of years, with some 20 years of experience in education in New Zealand, Korea, and Singapore. I was just wondering if perhaps if you could reflect on your global experience in education, and how would you characterize the background challenge we face this digital divide even before COVID started?
Thanks, Perry, for the introduction, and a real pleasure to join the panel today. A welcome to everybody, particularly in light of it being International Teachers' Day yesterday. A huge congratulations to all the teachers out there for the wonderful work that you've been doing, and leaders in supporting those teachers through what has been probably the most challenging time in our educational history that any of us have lived through. So huge kudos to all of you for the wonderful work you're doing. With regards to the question specifically about the characteristics of the digital divide, I think for me there are three core areas that we're facing: different access levels of technology itself, digital literacy and levels of digital literacy, and then ongoing professional learning, which can be inhibited or progress at different levels if access is there. What we're seeing is a rapid advance in many countries where we're really well supported and other countries being incredibly left behind. I think if I use UAE as an example, we sit in the UAE on 99.5% access to online learning and digital learning, which obviously puts us in a fantastic position. It's up from 65% in 2015. But if we contrast that to the continent of Africa, who is sitting on 13.5%, it's a staggering, unprecedented difference, that we're looking at in terms of the ability to progress learning, to progress teachers' understanding and development. And if we look at the information that came out from UNICEF during the pandemic's sort of first wave, where 1.5 billion students weren't accessing education, it's quite staggering to consider. Where many of us are trucking along thinking, how do we use this technology in the best way possible? How do we advance the learning? How do we support our teachers? Others simply don't have it at all. So the divide is there, and we have to look at ways in which we can make some changes.
So would you say that COVID has made that divide more of a chasm than it was before? Is it broader than that? I mean, you're obviously somewhere where there is very good internet connectivity, and I mean, based in other places like Singapore, which probably has the best in Asia. And yet, as you're mentioning there, other parts of the world, there was a case not long ago of a poor student in Sabah in Malaysia who had spent a couple of nights sleeping in a tree simply because she couldn't get Wi-Fi, her phone signal. And so these are some very realistic challenges. So do you think COVID has brought this has made this an even bigger problem for us now?
I certainly think it has. I think, one of the big differences that we face today as opposed to a similar situation like this, perhaps during the Spanish flu, is that the sort of learning that we have and the access to material doesn't exist in the same way. The ability to pass that on to students or to collaborate with students can't happen in the same way it used to be able to. And so whilst we could previously pass on knowledge, the areas that we're struggling with now in terms of accessing instantly pools of knowledge and being able to collaborate are either hugely advanced. We're looking at things like AI, and we're looking at coding and all these types of areas, which you just can't do it if you don't have access to technology. So you're starting to get this massive rift in what our students are able to enjoy and explore. And then similarly, whilst I think probably now, interestingly, more than ever, you've got access to wonderful learning online, in many cases free. Teachers who have the access are able to enjoy that, and they're developing, and they're able to log into courses at Harvard and everywhere else, no problem. So you're having one group heading off in a wonderful direction, accessing rich information and professional development, and another group that has been incredibly left behind because they don't have access to any of that.
So looking ahead, how are we going to start to deal with some of those challenges, do you think? What's your kind of initial feelings on this?
Well, I think that one of the things that has become paramount for all of our schools and all of our institutions is we have to have clear roadmaps in place to support our teachers and students. I mean, obviously the strategic plans of old sort of do have to be re-examined, given, a crisis like this shows how really they're not as watertight as perhaps we thought they were. But certainly a roadmap and where we're going with digital learning needs to be in place. And I certainly think that governments globally need to look at what minimum requirements are for students and how we can work globally to try and support those who are in need. Because I would say at this stage that the inability to access digital learning is an inability to access education in this particular age, and we're preventing students from being able to progress fairly if they don't have access to technology. That wasn't the case years ago.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. I'm gonna ask you to hold that thought, because I'd now like to turn to Naveen, who is also based in the UAE. And Naveen, I've seen that you're someone who's grown up in Dubai, but I can also see you're a man who wears many hats as well, as the CEO of Arcadia Education and also the CEO of an engineering services company too. So you've got a fair spread of things within the Al Shiraira family group. Now, I was just wondering, with Arcadia Schools, when I looked at your mission statement, it says Arcadia Schools brings learning to life with an inclusive culture, latest technology, and unique educational programs. And I'm taking it that's something that's well and truly predated COVID. So I was just wondering, how come you ended up putting technology so much at the forefront of your education philosophy? What was that background?
So when we, firstly, thank you, Perry, and thank you, Glenn. It's always tough to go after Glenn. He's done such an amazing job in giving you feedback on the digital divide. There's nothing much more I can add, but I'll make an attempt. As far as Arcadia is concerned, when we sat together in 2014 and we were formulating our strategy as a school, it was extremely important to the founders to have a school that would not only prepare students for the future, but would also in many ways espouse a life that was based on well-being. Now, and hence the name Arcadia. Now, technology, our stand on technology very early on was that technology is here to stay. And our students needed to have the skill set on how to master technology, regardless of the platform that is adopted in the future, the dominant platform, but they needed to have a tendency to accept that technology was going to be part of their lives.
Right.
So now technology for the sake of just technology, in our view, is pointless. We wanted technology to be one of the stimulants or catalysts for innovation. And we knew that innovation, technology drives innovation in many ways, but there's also other ways to drive innovation. So really that's where the thinking came for technology. It was to give students the skill sets they needed to prepare them for university and beyond, but also to ensure that we continue to innovate as an educational group.
And do you think that that focus helped you to deal with the significant challenges you and many other schools have had this year?
Yes, I mean, when I speak on behalf of schools and school leaders globally, we weren't given much time to move into a distance learning model. 2 weeks if we were lucky.
Yep.
Now, when you are a school that has adopted technology, the basics are in place. So you have the devices in place, you have the training in place, and then it comes to moving the curriculum online and then figuring out how you can replicate to at least some degree the classroom dynamics. And really that's what we were left with. So for us, we have a one-to-one Apple program. We're an Apple Distinguished School, which meant that we've been recognized by Apple Education for innovation. And it was, students, we knew the students had devices. And for those students, particularly the younger ones that did not have devices, because, we don't believe in giving devices out during the early years, we actually initiated a loan program, a device loan program, to make sure that every single child at our school had access. And Glenn emphasized on access. Access was and is just so critical. And really the basics of that is a device and bandwidth. And while we couldn't directly influence the bandwidth in residences, what we could influence was a loan program. So every single Arcadian had a device during lockdown and beyond.
Oh, right. So that was the one way you were able to make sure that you were able to deal with that. If I might, just before I move on, when it came to, having the access, having the technology, it's often having the teachers who are able to use those and increasingly with homeschooling, the parents as well. So if I might just move to the digital to also the human bit, because it's this interface. As I've tried to say with my background today, that's often so important in that. You can have the technology, but if you haven't got people know how to use it or excel in that. How were you able to sort of, broach that bit of the divide?
Great question. So firstly, I just want to give a huge shout out to 3 groups of people today globally. One is the healthcare workers who continue to, come in every day and fight what is a battle out there to get to save lives. The second is teachers. Teachers are often forgotten. As Glenn said, it was Teacher Appreciation Day. But in my view, it should have been called something else, because this year, the teachers have worked day in, day out. I'm a teacher, right? And I can tell you, teaching a hybrid model where you have students now in class and you have a minority of students still distance learning and doing that synchronously is one of the most challenging activities I have ever done in my entire life.
Right.
And to do that for an entire school day, lesson as lesson, is very, very challenging. And the third category is parents, right? I mean, we many of us are parents. I'm a parent. I can tell you, when I decided to have kids, I didn't sign up for being their full-time tutor at home. And while, let's say, I'm technologically adept, I just as easily could not have been technologically adept. So how do I figure this thing out? And really, there was, just as we had teacher training in the 2 weeks in the lead up, we also were into parent training. And interestingly enough, when it comes to parent training, it was the students teaching the parents on their device, on how to use their device.
Right.
And it was actually phenomenal to watch. So, one of the few benefits coming out of this pandemic is that parents have become so much more technologically adept, and they finally are like, oh, wow, now we know what our children are doing at school. And from an educator perspective, from someone who believes for parents as partners in this process of preparing children for the future, this has been great, and this has been one of the few good things that have come out of this crisis. And just on the digital divide, Glenn emphasized on access, but I'd also like to throw in another word that is extremely important, and that is equity. We could provide all the access in the world, but the fact is that just because you have access, it does not mean that you have equity when it comes to the digital learning. Simple example, families in conservative societies, let's say in certain parts of India, for instance, you have access, you have bandwidth, but the son gets to go first on the device, and the daughter follows. You have communities in Western societies as well that are largely, access has been provided, but they've been largely, they're not able to have the time to get onto their devices because this crisis has thrown out so many unique challenges, right? So it's, equity is just so important in this digital divide.
Yeah, and I think a very interesting point that you were just touching on there as well is not just the equity, but the fact that I'm interested to hear about the parent training. And one of the panel sessions yesterday, what came out very strongly was that parents are now, I think, appreciating what it is that teachers do, because now they've had to actually have the kids at home and try and do it. And I suspect that a lot more parents will now be much more thankful, and hopefully Teachers' Appreciation Days will be much bigger events than perhaps they have been in the past, because the parents are now truly realizing what it is that the kids have been up to and how much work it is being a teacher rather than just sending them off to school. Now, Ian, if I might just turn to you, I know you're in the UK, and I can see that Ruby it looks like she's joined us. It's got some issues with her cameras perhaps there. So, but Ian, if I might just turn to you, because you're based in the UK and you're in a slightly different end of the spectrum here in further education. And so I was just wondering, given your role, you've been at Bedford College, with Bedford Group of Colleges, for quite some time now as a long-standing CEO there. And obviously your institution's got a long history of teacher training as well. And obviously with a very diverse group of students. So you mentioned before that you had been surveying your students to find out how they'd been coping with this challenging time and this digital divide. And what sort of things were the students sort of saying to you?
Well, firstly, thank you for the invitation to this this conference. Yes, Perry, you're right. We decided we would, having gone into lockdown very quickly and very swiftly, as Naveen said, and trying to move very, very swiftly to more digital and blended learning, we would survey students, parents, and employers in our case, because we have several thousand apprentices as well as 10,000 adult students over 18 and 6,000 16 to 18-year-olds. And what came back strongly was, despite worries about health coming back, they wanted things to return to as normal a position as possible. And that was true of young people and the adults as well. So that sort of surprised us a bit. That's what they yearn for. Now that might just be the markets that we operate in, because further education colleges in the UK tend to take a disproportionate share of what might be termed the disadvantaged. But we also asked about some of the things Glenn talked about, the access, and we asked questions about, you know, do you have connectivity? Do you have a device? Do you have somewhere you can actually study in the house? And do you have, you know, what's your training like? Are you able to use those platforms like Teams and Zoom? And interestingly, we were surprised at how many, particularly young people, had rooms of their own to study in. But we were also surprised that 41% of students, and that was adults as well, had to share devices. So it was very common for there to be only one laptop or one computer in the house. And given that it was lockdown, you know, so there were people off school as well as off college, and parents on furlough, for example. Everybody was struggling to use the same machine. So that really has led us to think about how can we support that? Can we find devices for students? But that was the biggest blockage, much more than internet connectivity or having somewhere to study. So that they were really the big things for us that came out of the survey. And engagement, in terms of the divide, the engagement was quite interesting. The engagement was good, about 70-75%. But when we talk about normal attendance being in the sort of low 90% in a college environment, even for adults, it was pretty certain that the ones with the lower engagement were the more disadvantaged. So we are concerned about that. Sort of you know, people have been missing 6 months learning.
Yeah, and obviously those things that you picked up there, it's not just the technology, it's and I mean, interestingly, the learning space, because in multi-generational households here in Asia, that's quite a different challenge. You tend to have grandparents, parents, kids, then suddenly they're all at home, as you pointed out. We tended to find that a lot of those students had mobile phones, and a lot of the learning was suddenly gone, not just on laptops, but went on mobile phones. And our challenge was, for many of our colleagues, was how to get their material to be, you know, moved onto that as the main platform, rather than. And the other issue, of course, was not so much Wi-Fi, but it was having enough data download, because many people didn't have Wi-Fi at home. They were using their download packages on their mobile phones. So these are interesting challenges. So, I mean, teacher training is part of what you obviously do at the college there as well. So how do you see this changing your pedagogy and training for teachers and education in the future? What are some of the issues you're sort of reflecting on at the moment?
It's definitely changing that, and similarly, even our managers. I think a lot of management training now will be focused on how do you manage people remotely, as well as how do you educate people remotely. Right. So blending is definitely here to stay. I think I don't know if other people have found this, but one of the things we've found is that actually technology has actually made our management meetings and teacher management meetings better, where you've got established relationships. I think it's harder to use it to develop relationships or bring new staff into the organization, those sort of cultural things. And Naveen talked about, you know, those normal dynamics that you get in teaching. It's learning how to do that. You know, you can't do management by zooming about or teaching by zooming about in the way that you could in a more physical environment. So I think those are some of the things. The big issues I think we're finding is about things like safeguarding is obviously a big issue in school education across the world, and some of those things are quite difficult to be on top of in a more digital environment. So I think there's aspects of teacher education to do with that. But also I think the other thing is just teachers themselves, actually, can they switch off now? So I think we're going to have to do a lot more talking to teachers about how do they manage their own time, so they're not accessible 24 hours a day, because that's one of the things I think we've seen is a real degree of exhaustion that I've not seen before in our teaching staff. So just that sort of well-being dimension to teacher education, I think will be a very prominent part of the future.
Yes, and I think a lot of institutions are now finding they were very much face-to-face, then it went online. Now we're in a hybrid mode here. So we've got many students in our case who are stuck outside of Malaysia, cannot return at the moment. So we're not only conducting classes face-to-face, but we're having to now deal with all the students who can't come back. So our teachers have been stretched in two different ways. Yeah. And as you said, it's actually the increase on the workload and the different forms of delivery, whether face-to-face, online, and then trying to do some that crosses those two becomes extra challenging as well. Ruby, I'm glad you've been able to join us. I'm so pleased that the digital divide has not impaired you from joining us so far. So good morning and welcome. Can you hear us, Ruby?
I can. Thank you, Perry, and good morning, everybody.
Good morning. Look, it's great that you've been able to join us. And as I understand, you're the director of student determination office in the Department of Education and Knowledge, or ADEC, in the UAE. And I should explain to our audience that in this case, the term People's or Students of Determination refers to special education needs and students with disabilities, if I'm correct. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
So now I was just wondering perhaps if you could, from looking at this perspective, because we've discussed very briefly and touched on the topic of equity here and so forth. And clearly there are significant challenges that are facing students with special needs and with disabilities when it comes to digital divide. And so in your experience and how you've been dealing with this, what are some of the challenges that you've seen now coming forward with students that fall into those categories?
I think as colleagues earlier have said, Navin and Ian, first of all, it's around the staff and their ability to utilise technology, and that's a huge shift for a lot of staff, whether that's teachers, inclusion assistants, or other support staff, therapy staff working with people with a range of special educational needs, because a lot of the work is around behaviours and management, and not always about learning. So that was a huge challenge for families, as with all families, to shift from having that face-to-face interaction to having that access as well to digital technology. So great, we were able to provide access to all students. It was one of the first things we did, just as we did with other students, and ensured that each student had a device. So we ticked the boxes of those, and then came the challenges. So what we had to then do is really think about when we were developing all the policies for distance learning, and all our policies are available on the ADEC website for families to access as well as schools. It was there where we really had to think about students of determination and not forget them. And it's too often, and something very simple such as masks and ensuring that students who perhaps require auditory support or hearing impairment students, were able to see staff and have clear masks when they were obviously online and so on. So very, very simple areas that we address. But one of the biggest challenges was, of course, behaviour. And the challenges for some of our young people with autism and other educational needs that certainly had challenges with behaviour. And that was something that we had to really think the model and think about how those therapeutic services could be supportive and those staff could support the young people at home. So rather than directly interacting with the students, it was really to do with supporting the parents. So there was a lot more work with the parents because managing the behaviour was not something that students could obviously directly do without the support of the parents. So there was a lot of work, a lot of training done for parents and explaining to them how to manage behaviours.
Interesting. And how did you find that many of the parents were able to did that help them to become part of this and to understand the digital, or just, again, because we picked up on parents being in this conversation today as being very instrumental in what's been happening here. So how have many of them been able to handle it or not?
I think, as with everywhere else, there was a range on the spectrum for us. And what we did was target families where there was a greater need for behaviour and support the parents first to understand how to use the technology. And once we had the parents on board and being able to use the technology in the different platforms that were being utilised by the schools, was then ensure that the next step was going to be working with them very closely, and for them not just to have access through technology, but being able to pick up the phone and just say, look, I'm not quite sure what this video is on about, but we need to have this conversation. And I think parents did extremely well. I have to say, we were pleasantly surprised. Obviously, some parents are more tech savvy than others, and it certainly helped. And there was a lot of parent groups that were developed. And as Ian had said, whether it's staff or any other sort of meetings and collaborations, the online platform allows you to interact with a larger group of people, as well as be able to have regular meetings. So a lot of the parents were part of groups that were able to discuss and share some of their experiences as well.
Okay, and do you think, I mean, clearly different students have got different needs, but have there been any other advantages you found from this period? Because, I mean, some students, when you said it's behavioural, it's communication, sometimes they feel better in a digital environment than, say, in a face-to-face environment. So has it helped some students in any ways?
Definitely students who may have a range of challenges when it comes to communication and whether they're autistic young people or otherwise. And for some of those people, the fact that they didn't have to go in and communicate and go into lessons with peers and face other adults, it was a benefit. And there are obviously some young people and students who perhaps have very complex needs when it comes to communication, and for them and being able to access and go into school meant that obviously being at home allowed them to be able to have access to what their peers had access to as well. And the sessions often were tailored, as would be everything else, to each student, and looking at the individual healthcare and education plans to ensure that obviously their needs were met. But reviewing all of those plans actually meant that, as you said, some students were actually doing much better at home than they were with the face-to-face interaction. Okay, but it's interesting to get an all-round perspective on how this is worked out. But I mean, looking forward, and I'd now like to turn to that, because obviously we picked up on the fact that there was a digital divide before COVID came along. COVID has, in some respects, made that divide sometimes a bit of a chasm, but in other respects, I think it's thrown into sharp relief some of the challenges, because it's turbocharged in so many ways our move online. I was reading a report the other day that IBM had put out that made the point that, it has moved ahead online shopping by about 5 years on where they'd expected it to be at because of the change of people's behavior. They couldn't go shopping anymore, so they were forced online, and that's where they'll probably stay for a lot of things now. So, that's just one report that's come out about one small sector. So, ladies and gentlemen, looking now ahead to the future of how we're going to deal with this digital divide, because obviously we've got those issues of equity that you discussed, inequality, challenges of rich and poor.
if we're looking to make the world a better place, and if we're looking to educate the future generation to be in a space where they can contribute to that, how are we going to get over these hurdles? So, Glenn, just going back to you, because I know just as you were finishing in our first bit of the discussion there, you were touching on these issues of government policy. And do you think this is government issues, as to where this should sit? Is it a human rights issue? I think Naveen was touching on this as well, because years ago, I think it was the Finnish government that said it was actually a human right was to have access to the internet. And that everyone thought they were a bit crazy, I think, about 5 or 6 years or 10 years ago when they said that. But now that's where you're going. As you said, if you haven't got access to it, you don't have access to anything. So what's your thinking on how we're going to deal with this?
Yeah, look, I do think to a degree that it is, Perry, it's a right to access education and knowledge. And more today, because so much of our knowledge is changing instantaneously, you need to be able to access that information online. Most of it's shifted to different online portals and clouds, etc. So I do think it's important for us to ensure that as leaders, both within schools, within larger groups, and then obviously in government organisations, that we're looking to minimum standards to support our students and communities. Now, it's one thing to speak as a leader in international schools where we're very well resourced with great access and great technology, and 100% of our students and teachers have the ability to access that information. But if we're looking at other parts of the world, we need to ensure that those standards are in place. I think similarly, each organisation needs to look at what it is to put in place minimal standards or appropriate standards to be able to support students, both in times of crisis and in a standard learning environment. This is forced to change. This crisis forced us to re-examine where we sit and re-examine what is important to us. And I think, Ian touched on something interesting in terms of enhancements that it has forced. Some of the meeting schedules, people are more concise with meetings. You're able to maximize time. You're able to ensure that people are there for the right reason. And I think there's been some real positive that have come out of that, and working with students with disabilities. There's been a range of different positives. So the perfect time to re-examine pedagogically how we move forward. And this could be the largest shift, paradigm shift in education that any of us have seen. What's important is to take the good out of it and look to how we can support those who are missing out on quality.
Yes, because I mean, that's an interesting issue. I mean, you've raised that about how we get the standards right and who formulates those standards going forward. And Naveen, if I might, just to pick up on something you were saying earlier, which was that issue about what's happening in households. It's not just digital, it's cultural. So who gets access and when? And I noticed in your background that you've also have a charity that you work with as well to help, I think it's young girls in India go and be able to study in other parts of the world, if that's right.
Yes, that is correct. I just want to I know this is an EdTech conference, but I feel I need to say something here on the performance of the EdTech industry during what was arguably their grand stage. Right? I don't think anyone in their wildest dreams, unless you were Bill Gates, expected a pandemic to lock down the world and EdTech to step in overnight to substitute in-person teaching. So this was the examination of examinations for the EdTech industry. And you don't have to go very far. Speak to any teacher and they will tell you about the failure of EdTech to live up to expectations. The one thing we know for sure, and pre-COVID, we were always talking about what's the future of education or in-person education? What's the future of physical schools? That argument, in my view, has been laid to rest. Physical schools are here to stay. And EdTech did not and will not ever replace in-classroom teaching at the K through 12 level for various reasons, right? I mean, there is the whole social, emotional side, but there's also the nourishment side, right? There are students all over the world that get food at school, and school lunches plays just such an important role. I felt I need to say that the edtech industry actually has a long way to go if we believe that they will act as a substitute to physical schools. Now, when it comes to...
sorry if I might, that's an interesting point, because Glenn was also making the issue about whether we've got access to the world's best resources, the world Harvard professor. And I think, coming to Ian's space in further and higher education, it often begs the question, will we just have the one global professor who will give the lecture on statistics, history, whatever it might be? And how do we then, do we then have chatbots who deal with the rest? Or is it the opportunity for us to go back to education being what it was, which was about individual customization, of growing the individual rather than, what some people would have described as the sort of semi-industrialization of schools, putting everyone in nice little rows so they were all ready to go and work in factories. So how do you think, Naveen, that's going to go forward? Do you think education technology, chatbots and so forth will come into that? Or I'm hearing you very clearly saying, no, the teacher's now going to be much more front and center.
So if you look at the research, EdTech historically, even pre-COVID, has largely increased the divide, not narrowed it, right? So at the EdTech industry, I think, when we enter education as teachers, we enter it for a greater purpose. No one becomes a teacher for the money. But in EdTech, I think the EdTech industry needs to do some real soul searching, because up till this point, the products that have largely been put out there with the intention of democratizing education have done exactly the opposite. So I think that's, it's really, really important that, the more we dive into technology solutions, we have to be really, really careful on the grander question of what is the purpose of education, and are we serving that purpose? Now, in terms of government policy, there are a few things that can happen regardless of where the EdTech industry is heading, which I think will help. One is employment laws, right? And we saw the UAE leading the way about a week ago with the equal pay law that they came out with between men and women. Similarly, hearing what Ruby said, students of determination, as they become adults of determination and go into the real world, we need to have laws that accommodate for their employment. And I think that's important. We need to have maternity laws. We need to have paternity laws. So we have a long way to go when it comes to government policy in order to make our society more equal. The other thing is, if you really, really if we're really serious about narrowing the digital divide, we need to not only give out devices. So every school, and I'm a firm believer in this, every school, every private school needs to accommodate for giving a device within their tuition to every single student. I think that should be mandated by law. Similarly, bandwidth. I don't think bandwidth should be paid for. Bandwidth should be, it's like breathing air now, right? I think bandwidth should be provided free of charge. And when you have these type of laws coming in, that is truly when we will start narrowing the digital divide. But as of now, it's just increasing and increasing exponentially.
Right, so you're very much with that Finnish and Estonian kind of philosophy about making it free as human rights and so forth. Ian, if I might just turn to
human philosophy.
A human philosophy. Yeah, I picked up because I could see that your college has recently, been awarded some funding from the UK government for buildings and infrastructure. Now, given that resources are finite, where going forward for education do you put that investment? Is it into the physical, or is it into the infrastructure, the training for technology? And how do we get that balance right? Where are you seeing as a group?
It's a really interesting tension, Perry, because most of our money comes from the government, most of our capital investment, and politicians generally like to put money into things they can open and, very visible.
Cut ribbons.
So I mean, we do have to improve the college infrastructure, the buildings, but increasingly we're seeing the balance shift And when we're in charge of that, we're seeing the balance shift primarily towards IT and equipment infrastructures rather than buildings, but also in intangibles, things like staff development, even our brands, things like that. They're very important, but certainly in terms of the digital divide, you know, people want buildings that are comfortable. They don't need 5-star service, but they need with a good Wi-Fi infrastructure and things like that. But their number one thing actually of our students in terms of satisfaction is equipment and IT. That's just ahead actually of teachers, and that's just ahead of food. We get food in the canteen. So, you know, paying attention to what the customer, what the student, what the adult wants, what the employer wants is really important. And they rarely say we want really shiny buildings. They say we want much better industry standard equipment than IT and technology.
And I think that's across so many industries. I'm a hospitality and tourism academic by trade, and if I can put it that way, and most of the surveys have been showing about customer satisfaction with hotels. The first thing is about the Wi-Fi, not the beds or the food. It's about the Wi-Fi. So I don't know what point, as Naveen was pointing out, well, we're going to get beyond that when governments have legislated minimum download speeds or whatever. But that does seem to be the tension at whatever you're looking at, whether it's education or people traveling for business or leisure. So, I mean, back to you, Glenn, in terms of how you're seeing that go forward there, and given your experience on that, how do you now see this going forward in terms of where investments for schools and education would come in to get across that divide?
Yeah, I think as Navin said, those are some of the key areas that we need to ensure that every student has a device, that every student has access to broadband. I mean, obviously within the UAE and Saudi at the moment, where they're pushing for 5G for everybody, that's going to make things easier in this particular part of the world. But there's other parts of the world that are struggling massively with that, and we need to make sure that that's resolved, so that we can draw those connections that are essential to us being successful on the planet. You know, really, and that's the connectiveness of everybody being able to share where they're at. There's so many wonderful things that we can learn from each other. And whilst if we don't have access to connecting to those people who can teach us so much, simply because they're not connected, we're missing out as much as they're missing out. So I think the opportunity to connect us all will enable us to learn from one another and hopefully be able to do a lot to progress and protect the planet that we're on, which is another conversation altogether.
It is, and a very big one to have as well. Ruby, if I might just come back to you as we need to wrap up there. Time, unfortunately, is coming to an end to wrap up. But clearly, you know, making sure that there is equity, there is access, and for all. And so not because obviously if people don't have a voice, I guess the question is how do we do that? So I guess my question for you is, you know, how going forward are we going to be able to make this work for people in, you know, with special needs, and making sure that we can help them cross this digital divide?
I think it's not forgetting them. That's the most important factor to remember. It's very easy that once we have a policy or anything come through, that it's just an assumption that they would be able to access in the same way as well as other students. And I think not forgetting and clearly recognizing that their needs may be slightly different. They may require a different device. They may require something different. And that's okay, is something that we have to incorporate. Certainly when we were ensuring that every student had a device in Abu Dhabi, you know, students of determination were not forgotten. And that was absolutely critical. And I think ensuring, as Navin has said, and Ian and Glenn as well, just making sure that that divide, the gap doesn't become bigger, and that gap, whether it is for students of determination and mainstream students, or whether it's socioeconomic groups, certainly if you're in a socioeconomic group, plus you're a student of determination, I can assure you that gap is much wider. And that's what we've got to be really, really careful about. And as these young people move into the world of work, we need to ensure that that their needs are always part of what I always say is it's not when we're talking about inclusion, we have to be the ones who make the changes, not they adapt to our systems. So, we've got to make sure that we allow accessibility, and whether that's through technology or any other way, we need to make sure that those spaces and that digital divide is not another area and another target group that is part of that.
Okay, that's a very good point. Well, look, thank you all. I'm just very mindful of time today. I know that the organisers are trying to keep the conference running to time. So I would just like to thank all of you for those comments, because I think we want to make sure that the digital divide is not something that becomes a chasm, and it's something that we can find a way to close. And I think this has been a very insightful set of comments and thoughts as we chart a way forward in that, in terms of what has happened. Rian, have you come back? Rian, are you there? If not, then I will just like to thank, on behalf of EduTech and the organisers and our friends in Saudi Arabia, to say thank you all for your comments and insights today. To Glenn, to Naveen, to Ian, and to Ruby, we really have appreciated your comments, your thoughts, and your insights. And the conference, we wish the rest of this conference to the insights of how education technology. And as I said, the challenges ahead, and hopefully as we keep these discussions open, it's ways of crossing those divides going forward. So thank you again all very much, and thank you to everyone who's been listening to us today or at a recorded session at some point in our inevitable digital future. Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, wherever you may be in the world. Bye-bye.